So I'm here to talk about the changing landscape of research promotion, the increasing focus that appears to be emerging on author reputation. So it's very much a step outside of traditional scholarly outputs, and as such I'm very aware that this session will be probably a little bit like Marmite. If it sparks any debate though, all to the good. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time taking a step back to look at the different drivers, the different trends and pressures now affecting researchers and authors, because I think they really shape how we respond. So who am I? Why am I here? Well, I've worked in scholarly publishing for over 15 years now, but for the last 3 years I've worked in the world of research communications. So research media works directly with researchers, with higher education institutes, as well as research-based associations on their communications and outreach strategy. As a comms agency, we specialise very much in taking very complex research materials and translating them for consumption by a range of audiences, whether that be non-specialist peers, policymakers, industry leaders, or an informed lay public. We do this via a range of channels, micro-publications through to full publications, infographics, animations, video, and other digital outputs. So why do I think this is a topic worth discussing? I think the why here is arguably far more important than the how. I think the how, as with many good solutions, is actually quite simple. The how presents both the context and the impetus for change. It's a great article by Biswas and Kircher, which was published in the Straits Times last year, called Professor No One Is Reading You. And VTech really did touch on this in terms of whether people are reading journals and are reading articles. This is contentious, obviously, in a world which is still very focused on traditional citation-led metrics, but it hits the nub of the challenge quite nicely. So the volume of research produced, the volume of research published is increasing year on year, and there are plenty of stats out there, some of which shown on the screen now, and some of which disputed to a greater or lesser extent, but nevertheless all point to one trend. It's a huge mass of research that is produced and then that essentially disappears down a black hole. Either it never reaches publication, and as you can see here, we've got 50% of EU-funded research that has no article outputs, and over 15 million person hours estimated to be spent on unpublished research every year. If it does reach publication, there are question marks over whether it's read, and question marks over whether, therefore, it gets cited. That's a lot of potentially wasted time. It's a lot of potentially wasted research budget. On the flip side, there's a growing body of evidence which shows quite clearly that research that is clearly communicated and promoted increases engagement significantly. Now, that's obviously not a groundbreaking revelation, but it does point to a need to shift the mindset and the services offered to researchers when promotional activities need to become a more integral part of the scholarly research cycle. But, and there's always a but, there is still a conflict. Universities do still value the scholarly record, and there's a whole industry which supports the traditional form of scholarly record. So what is the impetus to undertake broader communications, and do the two have to be mutually exclusive? There is, of course, a very, very clear funding impetus here. The REF here in the UK placed a strong focus on impact in 2014, which by all accounts is only set to increase in importance. You have Europe's biggest research framework programme, Horizon 2020, also having a very heavy weighting, estimated to be almost a third now, towards broader impact, effective communication and effective dissemination strategies. You also see broader economic, societal, political, cultural and economic impact featuring very strongly in many US funding mandates now. There's also an impetus from the public. Public does want to engage with research, and there's pressure for universities and for researchers to undertake public engagement activities. A large percentage of the public want to know more about research before it happens. They also want to know about it whilst it's happening. But 58% believe that too little effort is made to inform them, and 40% believe that communication about research is poor. I actually think that's quite a low stat. Only 28% trust science journalism, which speaks to a need, I think, both to improve perceptions about this profession, but also to offer alternatives, ideally fronted by the researcher or the research institution itself. Finally, of course, there's the individual impetus. So in such a crowded room, how do you make yourself stand out? Knowing how to stand out, or even wanting to stand out, doesn't necessarily come naturally to researchers. You do get the social media rock stars amongst them, for whom it is second nature, but for many, they've been trained to communicate in a certain way, in peer-to-peer language. Their first love is doing the research, not writing about it necessarily, and certainly not promoting it. They do understand the value, and I speak to researchers every day who understand the value, but they can very much be at sea knowing where to start. So before I move on to look at what really are some very simple steps towards maximising visibility of research, I think it's also useful to look at trends that are supporting the changes we're seeing in researcher behaviour and researcher needs. All of these are relevant when you look at them as a whole and when you join the dots. And these trends create quite a different landscape for the researcher to operate in, and they also present publishers and service providers with an opportunity, I think, to respond. As I've said, I've worked in scholarly publishing for about the past 15 years or so, and I'm sure many of you have similar tenures in the industry. What I've seen in the past 5 or so years, though, in both the industry and in our key markets, is a lot of change, some of which sticks, some of which doesn't. But I think the changes that have really driven the author market centre around changes to format and distribution of content through multiple channels, changes to the research budget and a greater focus on return on that investment, an opening up of the education market, and the increasing power of the consumer, so in this case, the student. As already mentioned, research funding is one of the biggest single drivers. Funding dynamics are increasingly challenging, with many countries seeing a flat or declining profile and a greater focus on accountability to the public purse. What you see in funding distribution is that it is very heavily concentrated, but where perhaps it's traditionally focused on fundamental research, it's now applied research which clearly demonstrates economic and social value that's prioritised. With declining research budgets, universities also have to look for alternative funding sources, either through private funding, through crowdsourcing, etc. With this also comes greater accountability to communicate outcomes more effectively, for results to have very clear benefits to society or the economy, or for there to be a very clear bench-to-market strategy. I've mentioned impact too. The many, feels like hundreds, I think, conferences and white papers that were on the back of the REF 2014 say that impact is here to stay. One offshoot of this, and an offshoot of the grand challenges that are highlighted in Horizon 2020 funding, is a greater focus on interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary research, research across borders, and research in partnership with industry, particularly through Horizon's SME instrument. Again, this forces a change of mindset. So research isn't or shouldn't be locked away. It's open, it's collaborative, and dare I say it, it's also commercial. At the other end of our spectrum, we have our consumers, the students. So as we know, these are now internationally mobile, they're paying for their education, and they have high purchasing power, or increasingly high purchasing power. They want simple, quick, easy information. They want the same experience they get in their consumer lives. That means that traditional content formats and traditional channels are being challenged, And as a researcher seeking to attract the eyeballs of this key market segment, you do need to learn to communicate in a different way. Students are also, of course, the researchers of the future, and they're going to drive the change themselves if we don't, and I think we ignore them at our peril. Linked to this, technology advances mentioned by VTech earlier are shaping not only the scholarly record, but education and learning. The standard traditional form of communicating research starts to feel very outmoded. Equally, the idea of research just being communicated statically at one point in time when the world around it keeps moving seems very old-fashioned. Multiple channels and new tools offer the opportunity for research to be in this constant state of beta, and as such there are multiple points in the research cycle where research can and should be communicated. It's not just about the finished article anymore, and Vitek talked about that quite succinctly. In response to these changing funding dynamics and the changing demands from students, universities themselves are also having to think and behave differently. They're behaving more and more like businesses, even if some of them don't want to. They're in a war for talent, they're competing for funding, they're competing for great researchers and for great students. They have to promote themselves, and they have to promote the great research that's been undertaken at their institutions. There are some fantastic examples of universities doing this really well. Here in the UK, examples like Nottingham, like Huddersfield, to name a few. Universities, though, also need to build collaborations with industry through this, and promotion is one way of them securing that. They need to build collaborations with industry to drive funding, to drive knowledge transfer, and to drive commercialisation. Very much linked to this, most universities now have a very strong focus on public engagement and outreach. They're actively seeking to gauge beyond the academy, and this filters through to individual researcher objectives as well. Institutions and individuals, I think, are being switched on to the idea that to engage more broadly, traditional formats are inadequate and they do need to be complemented or supplemented. They need different language, different tone, and they need different media. So where to start? Well, the simplest place, obviously, is with the academic record itself. We all know journals, and unlike VTech, I'm not here today to say the journal is dead or the traditional version of the article is no longer needed. Equally, however, we do know that most of this research is impenetrable to a broader audience. Of course, open access removes some barriers, but just because research can be accessed doesn't mean it's accessible. So in terms of the impetus to change, the impetus to engage, and the trends in the academic landscape, the academic record, as I've said, does need to be complemented and supplemented with something else. One of the most powerful ways to achieve this, I think, and to maximise engagement is through storytelling. So contextualisation, a personal story, simplification of the message and key points, a clear narrative, and a familiar voice or a familiar language combined to create an output or a set of outputs that anyone with an interest could understand. It's not about being liberal with the truth, it's certainly not about dumbing down. There is significant craft that goes into this. Simplification of very complex messages is a skill, as is effective visualization, as is thinking about how the outputs will be found through effective SEO, etc. The craft itself is one surmountable challenge, and there are experts out there that can help. But going back to that statistic of only 28% of the public trusting science journalism, it also needs to be the voice of the researcher speaking. So they need to be part of this process of making the storytelling trusted and credible. It's what the conversation arguably does very well, and with the engagement statistics to prove it. But ultimately, it's about clear communication. It's about following the basics of any strong promotional plan. As I said, the how is not the hard bit. From an initial comms plan, which identifies who you want to engage, to the actual outputs themselves, whether that be a powerfully succinct lay summary, an infographic or illustration, a policy briefing, an animation, a video summary. The how is the easy bit once you understand the wider context. I think this essentially creates a small bank of collateral that attaches itself or could attach itself to the academic record, and it acts as a research CV. Everything you need to communicate if you want to attract funders, collaborators, industry partners, something you take to events or send out to interested parties, something that you use via social media channels, in your research brochure. It helps to build your brand as a researcher, and it helps to build interest. So for us in the room, it's about responding to this change, understanding the backdrop against which many researchers we work with are battling, and some are really struggling to respond to. We need to provide them with services that assist them in this new era of broader communications and impact. And there are many of us already doing this. Some of us have been looking at various stages of the research cycle for some time now, from sharing and collaboration tools such as Mendeley and ResearchGate, to research journalism sites such as The Conversation, through to reputation management tools like Kudos, and storytelling platforms like Before the Abstract and the Story Collider. I think the power of this will actually be when it all joins up to create something that's seamless for the customer. The more qualitative services need to merge with the more quantitative services to create something that's end-to-end. It's still very much emerging at the moment. It's an emerging picture, and many of us are finding our way. But I do think, as a whole, we're onto something that's really quite transformative. And I'm pleased to get the first David Bowie picture into the conference. My team did challenge me to sing changes, but thankfully that's not going to happen. So that is all I have to say, and I think questions are at the end. So I'll hand over to Rick.